And thank you for the invitation to come and speak on this section of the Old Testament. My role at Tabor, as we've got up there, is as Dean of Ministry Practice. So Tabor is divided into three faculties: Education, Humanities and Social Sciences, and Ministry Practice, and I look after that third faculty. But really the reason I got into this gig in the first place was because I love the Old Testament. I love to teach the Old Testament, I love to preach from the Old Testament, and hopefully through what we've got to share tonight, you'll also grow in your knowledge and love of the Old Testament as well. So that'll be great if we get there. Let me begin just by handing out the handout. And actually, thanks, Miranda. And while Miranda's doing that, maybe we can open in prayer. Lord, we thank you this evening that you are a good God, that you're a gracious God, that you're a God who wants what is best for your people. And Lord, as part of that, part of your character, as part of your desire, you have revealed your character to your people and you've given them instructions and guidelines for how we are to live. And Lord, as your created beings, as the people who have been knit together by your hand and breathed into life, we know that you know what is best for us and that your instructions are good and holy. So Lord, as we reflect on this text, this series of books this afternoon or this evening, Lord, I just pray that these things would come alive, Lord, that this wouldn't be a distant, archaic kind of historical interest, but Lord, through these words, we would gain inspiration and insight into how you would have us live as human beings and how you would have us live as your people today. We thank you for the gift of the word. We thank you for the gift of your people. We thank you for the gift of the Spirit that causes your word to come alive in our hearts. Lord, we pray these things in your precious Son's name. Amen. Okay, so all the handouts is out, that's good. In the brief that Miranda sent through to me for tonight, she suggested that I try to cover 5 different goals in 1.25 hours. What I realised as I was working through that is that Miranda is obviously a more efficient teacher than I would be. I might struggle to get through one goal, let alone 5, within such a short time frame. What I am going to do is try to give you kind of a big picture introduction to the 5 books that we're going to be looking at in this 6-week seminary. And those books, if we don't know them already, are Job, Psalm, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs. Okay? And I'm going to be trying to spend some time this evening kind of unpacking how they relate to each other, how they fit within the Old Testament as a whole, and also how they help us live better today. Now, that's kind of a big picture, and when we're dealing with those 5 books, what we've got to realise is even though they kind of get grouped together very often, there is quite a significant degree of difference between them. And so although I'll be giving you a broad introduction to the 5, I'm probably going to spend most of my time really focusing in on those 3 or 4 books that are classified or that belong to the category which is generally referred to as the wisdom literature. Okay? And so which of those 5 books do we think are going to be falling into the wisdom category? Proverbs, of course, yep. Ecclesiastes, yes. Job is the other one, and kind of Song of Songs, although that's got a funny kind of relationship, but we'll put it there anyway. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time looking at Psalms this evening, other than kind of a big picture kind of thing, but there'll be plenty of time, I assume, for us to go back and unpack that as we go through this course. Now, there'll probably be a time for question and answer at the end, but I'm also going to try to spice through some exercises and kind of discussion points as we go through the evening. Who's worked all day or looked after grandchildren or looked after children all day? Probably a few of us here. So I'll try to keep it engaging, and there'll be a bit of interaction backwards and forwards as we go, so you can stay awake for the first 1.25 hours or so as we're working through what I've got to share. Okay, so let's begin by giving you kind of an overview of the first 5 books. Now, it's possible to divide the Old Testament up into all kinds of different ways, all kinds of different structures. According to Jewish tradition, though, the Old Testament is kind of divided into three major parts or three major sections. If we look at the next slide, you'll see them there. The first section in Jewish tradition is referred to as the Torah, and we would translate that kind of as, often it gets translated shorthand as law. I'm not a big fan of that translation because that kind of can have very negative overtones for us as good evangelical Christians. What's the law got to do with us anymore? Aren't we under grace? All that kind of thing. So instead of talking about law as the translation of Torah, probably instruction is a better way to refer to that. And there is narrative instruction, there is legal instruction. That's the first section, though, the Torah. Christian tradition, we refer to it as the Pentateuch, and in some ways it's the most central section, probably the most important section in the Old Testament. People, of course, love my teaching that I do at Tabor. Okay? So they come up to me. They know I teach two advanced exegesis subjects. One is I teach advanced exegesis of the prophets, and the other is I teach advanced exegesis of the Torah or the Pentateuch. And they come up and they sometimes say, my pathway's kind of getting a bit full. I don't have a lot of choice left. Which one do you think I should study out of those two? And my initial response to that is that's kind of like asking me, which is my favourite out of my four children. I love all of this Old Testament. It's all really important stuff. But in some ways, the Torah, the Pentateuch, is kind of the central, it's the foundational aspect of the Old Testament. It's really where lots of the key Old Testament events take place. Creation, Noah, Abraham, the patriarchs and matriarchs, Exodus from Egypt, giving of the law at Sinai, all those kinds of really foundational central events to Israel's identity are found there in the Torah. Okay, so that's the first section. The second section is the Nevi'im, which we just simply translate as prophets. What do you notice, though, when you have a look at that list, which is called prophets? Okay, they're not named after prophets. They're not really what we would call prophets in the Christian tradition, are they? You'd certainly say that this latter group here, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, to 2 Kings, okay? Torah, Nevi'im, and then the final section is really the section that we're concerned with for this kind of 6 weeks or so. The Ketuvim, which is also known as, or translated as the writings. And this is kind of, in my mind, the miscellaneous grab bag, okay? So we're not going to put it in the Torah. It doesn't seem to belong in the prophets. Where does it go? The writings, okay? And everything kind of finishes up in there. And the dominant kind of texts that we find in here, the dominant genres, are kind of twofold. We have the wisdom literature, and we also have songs. Okay, wisdom literature and songs being psalms and also Song of Songs as well. Okay, so that's where we're looking at today. Does anyone know, just out of interest, what the Jews referred to the Old Testament is? Because, of course, they're not going to talk about it as the Old Testament, because that would imply there is a kind of a scriptural New Testament or a New Covenant. Does anyone know, out of interest, what they call it? No, they call it the Tanakh. And the reason for that is actually for the 3 key sections of their Old Testament. Tanakh, the Tanakh, the Old Testament, okay? But for this evening, our focus is on Ketuvim, and in particular, Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs. Okay, now as a group, this final section is actually quite different in character from the other sections of Scripture, okay? So if we want to look at the Pentateuch, what genre dominates the Pentateuch? There's probably two that we might think of. And when we talk about genre, we're talking about the type or the category of literature. What dominates those first 5 books? So there's story, history, narrative. Okay, so narrative is one of the key genres that we find there. What's the other key genre that we find there? There's a lot of law as well, isn't there? You know, as soon as you get into the second half of Exodus 19 onwards is dominated by law. Then we get into Leviticus. My personal opinion as I teach on it, that Numbers is the least read book of the Bible. Why? Because we get about halfway through Leviticus and we give up at that point. But we've got a lot of laws in Leviticus around all kinds of strange, weird and wonderful acts that the people are doing, you know, sacrifice, priestly rules, obligations, clean and unclean, all those kinds of things. Okay, so that's within Leviticus. The first half of Numbers up to about Numbers 10, which is when the narrative resumes. Again, a whole lot of laws there. And Deuteronomy, well, that's name literally means second law. Okay? So a lot of the material that we find in the Torah is the law. Okay? And so we have specific commands from God. Okay? So that's the first part, specific commands for God. When we have the prophets, and in particular the latter prophets, that I'm going to be concerned with, what do we have here? What do we find a lot in the prophets? How do they introduce what they've got to say? Thus saith the Lord. Okay, so it's a word from God. Okay, a prophetic word, a prophetic oracle, a word from God. So the law is dominated by laws from God. The prophets is dominated by words or oracles from God. So we want to say that in both these sections, what we're dealing with is theology or revelation from above. Okay? So it's revelation that is coming down from God and being given to his people. Okay? That's either in the form of the revelation of law, that God's giving them specific commands, obligations, expectations that they're meant to follow, or it's coming down in the form of prophetic words. And so God is telling them about how he wants to live as a covenant people, about how they need to kind of respond in faithfulness, about what the future kind of might hold and how they're to live, or maybe how to shape their life in the present in the light of that, okay? But in both of those, we're dealing with theology or revelation from above. The writings, though, are different in character from the law and from the prophets. The writings in particular are concerned with humanity's response to God. Okay? So we're not dealing with theology or revelation from below. From above? Just gave it away there. You know, not theology, revelation above, but theology, revelation from below. This is human beings speaking back to God. And so there is a German Old Testament scholar. Germans dominate Old Testament scholarship for good or ill. A guy called Gerhard von Rad. He referred to the writings as the human answer. Okay, the human answer to what? God's revelation, God's giving of his word, giving of his law. Okay, they're Israel's response to God's great act of deliverance and revelation in her history. And so this is, I think, a good quote. The Old Testament writings show us that when these mighty acts of Yahweh occurred, so when God worked on behalf of his people, Israel did not keep silent. Not only did she repeatedly take up her pen to recall these events of Yahweh to her mind in historical documents, but she also addressed Yahweh in a wholly personal way. She offered praises to him and asked him questions and complained to him about all her sufferings. For Yahweh had not chosen his people as a mere dumb object of his will in history, but for converse with him. So when we get to the writings, really what we're hearing a lot is Israel's side of the conversation. We're hearing about humanity's response to the acts of God in her life and in her history as God's people. So one of the things that we've been talking about, one of the suggestions was, well, how might these texts help us live better today? Well, one of the first things that I think these texts point to is that human beings are made for converse with God. You know, human beings are not made simply to be the mere passive recipients of God's will, of God's revelation to his people, as important as that is, don't get me wrong, okay? But the writings actually model to us the importance of our response to God, of taking seriously what God has said to us, but also taking seriously our response to him in praise, in worship, in adoration, and also in questioning. Okay? We find that particularly coming through into texts like Ecclesiastes or Job. And the writings, texts like Psalms, texts like Proverbs, texts like Ecclesiastes, provide us examples and guidelines for how that might take place, what that converse might look like. I mean, that's really been the history of the Psalms in Christian tradition, is that the Psalms have given us a language of response. They've given us a language of worship, of praise, of speaking back to God. And I kind of have this pet peeve a little bit that, we kind of get, we give out to new Christians, and what kind of Bibles? What do we give them in their Bibles? We might give them, if we're kind of saving money, we'll give them the New Testament. And then what else do we give them? The Psalms and Proverbs, okay? And so we kind of shortchange them a little bit on what's meant to be there. But the logic of that is that the Psalms and Proverbs have provided us with that guidelines, that wisdom, that examples about how we might respond in prayer and praise and lament before God. So what does it say about a robust, healthy Christian life? Which suggests that that's a life of dialogue, that that's a life of response, that that's a life of genuine engagement with God, that God actually wants to hear about where we're at, how we're responding, how we're travelling with him. Okay. Cool. Any questions about that so far? That's kind of the big picture, kind of overview stuff so far. Now, okay. Let's now pump into a little bit. I want to focus on a lot for this evening into the wisdom literature, okay? Particularly Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes, okay? And a point that I want to make is that the wisdom books are actually quite diverse, both in terms of form. So when I talk about form, I'm talking about how they communicate to us. And they're also quite different in terms of content. So form is about how, content is about what they've got to say. Okay, so to kick it off, begin, a bit of an exercise. I could have grabbed any chapters out, okay, realistically, but I've just got two there. Pick up your Bibles, open them up, have a discussion with the people on your table, compare Proverbs 13 with Job 6, and how do you think they're similar and how are they different to each other? Okay, I guess keeping in mind those issues of what we're talking about, form and content in particular. Have a look through, maybe think about it yourself. Feel free to have a discussion. We'll then hear some feedback as well. Okay, maybe add another minute or two to work through that. Okay, maybe 30 seconds, just share your last couple of ideas, make sure everyone's had a chance to have a quick chat. Okay, maybe we'll start with the book of Proverbs, just 13 as a representative example. What were some words that you were throwing around to describe what the book of Proverbs is like in terms of form and content? If I had a whiteboard up here, I'd jot them down as we go along. You'll just have to kind of write them out as we say them. Okay, so what were some things that stood out to you when you were working through Proverbs? Okay, so lots of sayings in it, yep, okay. And we kind of have modern equivalents to these kind of like popular sayings as well, don't we? You know, a stitch in time saves nine, and well-known kind of aphorisms, as it were. Yeah, okay, so lots of different sayings, yep. And so within that one chapter, I mean, I didn't count it, what are we dealing with? You've got 25 different verses there. You probably almost have 25 sayings within that chapter, okay. It's a list, okay? It's not a narrative. And each of those one may kind of lend itself, or one may kind of lead into the other, but at the same time, each of those could be pretty much plucked out and you could make sense of it. It's kind of a disconnected list of Proverbs rather than kind of an extended narrative. Hope deferred makes the heart sick, but a longing fulfilled is a tree of life. Or dishonest money dwindles away, but whoever gathers money little by little makes it grow. Okay, all of these kind of can belong by themselves. Okay, anything else that stood out to people as you're working through? Lots of contrasts, that's right. And often what you'll find is that there is some sort of contrast within the Proverbs being set up between the first line and the second line of the proverb. And that's probably another thing to know, that Proverbs really often communicate very fixed structure, and they often communicate just over those two lines. Or, scholars will talk about there'd be a couplet to the Proverbs with some sort of contrast between the first line and the second line. Good. Anything else that stood out to Okay, fantastic. So it's direct. Okay, so it's written directly to the reader. It's given instructions to the reader, and in particular, I mean, could we categorise what kind of instructions it's about? Advice on how to live. That's right. And in particular, how to live a successful, kind of flourishing life, isn't it? That's right. And kind of the background to this is that these are often probably had their origins in kind of the instructions that parents would give their children in particular. I mean, we're dealing with a patriarchal society, so often kind of the instruction that was expected to give to sons in particular to help them flourish and get ahead and succeed in their different endeavours. Okay, cool. Anything else that people wanted to talk about? That's a good one though. It's written directly to the reader, isn't it, to make sense of. Yep. There's no middle ground. Fantastic. So it's very kind of black and white in terms of the way that it works. And there seems to be this real logical connection between good actions and good outcomes as well happening. Okay. So this real sense of black and white coming through. Okay. That's a pretty good going so far. Anything else before we move on to Job? You thought, actually, that was really good. Anything maybe from the back table that you wanted to share? Oh, no. You can just say, no, everyone else has already said what we were talking about. That's the advantage of going last, okay? Okay, so we've got Proverbs that we've looked at. What about if we go have a look at Job 6? Maybe we can start with the back table now, okay? Did you get to Job 6? What stood out to you about Job 6 in comparison, maybe? Okay, fantastic. So it's quite a long recording of a conversation, and in fact, within the chapter itself, it's a big speech that Job gives, isn't it? Yep. Okay, so it's a speech, yep. Okay, what else? Okay, so Job's questioning a lot of things. The author of Proverbs is assuming a lot of things about how reality works, about correlation between action and outcome. Job's really questioning a lot about what he sees happening in the world around us, around him. He's seeking clarification. Okay, yep. So he's trying to learn through this process as well. Yep. Okay. Okay, emotional and despairing. That's right. That's right. And there's that real personal kind of struggle that's going on. Is there any sense of kind of personal struggle or engagement within a proverb? Not really. It's just kind of giving you how things work. Job's is all about his own personal questioning, struggles, issues with kind of his own life situation in the light of the broader theology. Anyway. Good point. Okay. What about, does it directly address the reader in the same way as Proverbs? Not really. It's not directly teaching us. It's kind of more talking about Job's kind of own questions. Now, that does teach us, and we do learn through those experiences for sure, but it doesn't kind of address the reader in the same way that Proverbs does. Fantastic. So we're kind of only indirectly hearing it, aren't we? Whereas Proverbs, it's directly addressing us. Job, good point, is either talking to his friends or he's talking to God, and we are kind of overhearing the conversation that's taking place. Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. Okay. So if I was to say Job and Proverbs... Oh, sorry. Yep. Great point. Yep. Fantastic, and thanks for raising that. That's a really good point. Yep. So it's really helpful to know what would say broader the literary context of Job's speech, what's come before and after. And that will help you to make sense of what he's trying to say and his points. Whereas when you get to the Proverbs, you can really largely kind of extract them. And it doesn't necessarily matter really what came in the verse before or afterwards. It's understandable by itself. Okay. So if I was to say to you now that Job and Proverbs belong both to the same genre, type or category of literature, you might not get there yourself, would you? Because they are actually quite different in terms of the form and in terms of the content of what they've got to say. Nevertheless, we still group them together. So what I want to do for a bit of time now is to focus on some of the key things, some of the key characteristics, some of the key features that these books that we refer to as the writings, and in particular the wisdom literature, hold in common. Some of the characteristics that unite and define them. Okay, so the first one that I want to say is that wisdom literature and the writings in general, certainly we put the Psalms and Song of Song in here as well, are international. And what I mean by that is that wisdom literature, the Psalms and Song of Songs, is really not unique to Israel. In fact, ancient Near Eastern wisdom literature had existed for more than 1,000 years before Israel began to make its own distinctive contribution. So it's not unique necessarily to Israel. This is something that the Old Testament itself clearly recognises. And if you've got your Bibles there, you might want to turn to 1 Kings 4, 30 to 31. So he's talking about the most wise person of all, Solomon. Solomon's wisdom, 1 Kings 4, 1 Kings 4, verses 30 and 31. Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the people of the East, and greater than all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than anyone else, including Ethan the Ezrahite, wiser than Haman, Kalkol, and Dardar, the sons of Mahol, and his fame spread to all the surrounding nations. Now, that text makes a clear assertion about Solomon's wisdom, but it also makes an implicit assertion about wisdom more generally, doesn't it? It says that Solomon was the wisest, But what does it also recognise? That there is wisdom elsewhere as well. Okay, there is wisdom in, what does it talk about? Wisdom in the people of the East and the wisdom of, what's the other group? Egypt as well. Okay. So if we put our map up here of the ancient Near East, Israel, nicely highlighted for you there in green. When it talks about the wisdom of the East, what it's talking about is the wisdom of Mesopotamia, okay? And in particular, the wisdom that we find in Babylon and Assyria. And then it's also talking about the wisdom of Egypt as well. So in other words, this whole area, which we sometimes refer to as the ancient Near East, in geography, we might have heard another name for it. This kind of crescent that we find here. Do we know what it's referred to as? The Fertile Crescent. Okay. Why? Because it's got your rivers up there. It's got your Nile. It's got your Euphrates and Tigris, really the home of kind of agriculture. All of this region had its own kind of wisdom literature, wisdom tradition that was around before Israel's and that kind of existed alongside Israel's as well. Okay. And when you're reading the wisdom literature of the ancient world, you realise how similar Israel's actually is to it. That Israel really has got this international character, international flavour to its wisdom literature. You're struck by the many parallels, both in terms of form and also in terms of content with the biblical wisdom literature. Basically, there were two kinds of wisdom literature in the ancient world, and you've already found them when we're looking at Job and we're looking at Proverbs, okay? There was, one category was practical wisdom, which consists of brief proverbial sayings which offer observations and instructions about life in general. Usually quite positive in tone, and it's often addressed to young people about how they are to live, how they're about to succeed in their life. The biblical example here would be Proverbs. Okay, falls into this category. I'll give you here an example of practical proverbial wisdom from outside Israel. And if you're interested, you can look it up further. There is a YouTube clip that you can play, and that'll do a bit of the comparison work for you. But what we can do is we can have a look at Proverbs and we compare it to an Egyptian text called a Menemope, or the instructions of a Menemope. And what we'll see is that there is actually quite a lot of similarity, a lot of overlap. Now, a Menemope probably comes from about 1300 to 1100 BC, which is about, let's say broadly speaking, 150, 200 years before Solomon's time. Okay? Let's have a look there. Proverbs 22:24. Do not make friends with a hot-tempered man. A Menemope, do not associate to thyself the heated man. Okay. Or if we go in Proverbs 15:16, better is little with fear of the Lord than great wealth and trouble along with it. Or a Menemope, better is bread when the heart is happy than riches with sorrow. Okay, and if you want to, we can look it up. You can have a look at some of the other proverbs that we find in a Menemope. That's one example. These small, pithy aphorisms, proverbs, instruction about life, and in particular, how to succeed in life. It's one group. The second group is what's called speculative wisdom. And this has longer documents which contain extended speeches that grapple with life's most difficult questions. What do we think some of the questions these texts might grapple with would be? Why? Okay, fantastic. Yep. So why? Two questions in particular. Why suffering is often there. And the other question they often grapple is, well, why do the wicked actually get ahead in life? Okay, because that shouldn't work out really when you think about things. Why? Okay. These tend to be more pessimistic in tone. So the other ones are positive. These tend to be more pessimistic. And they're often quite critical of the proverbial wisdom that we find. Okay. The biblical example here would be Job. Okay. But let me give you here an example from a Mesopotamian text called Ladlel Bel Nemeki, which means I will praise the Lord of wisdom. Okay. And when it's talking here about the Lord of wisdom, it's not talking about Yahweh, God of Israel. It's actually talking about Marduk, who's the chief god of the Babylonian pantheon. This is an excerpt from the text, though. I, who strode along as a noble, have learned to slip by unnoticed. Though a dignitary, I have become a slave. To my many relations, I am like a recluse. If I walk the street, ears are pricked. If I enter the place, eyes blink. My friend has become foe. My companion has become a wretch and a devil. My intimate friend has brought my life in danger. Now, if I hadn't told you beforehand that that was actually from a Mesopotamian text, what would you have thought? That it came from Job, that's right. Or maybe that it had come from perhaps one of the Psalms, might be one of your options. But you probably pretty well would have just picked up and assumed that we're dealing with a biblical text. But we're not. This is part of the international character of wisdom literature. This is an example of a text from ancient Mesopotamia. And so these parallels suggest that the Old Testament wisdom writers were not concerned with reinventing the wheel. Okay? They were influenced by a broader international tradition of wisdom. And so overall, we'll have to say that the wisdom literature is remarkably open and affirming. The sages, the wise men and wise women of ancient Israel, found it possible to affirm many of the values and teachings that came from outside the community of faith. They appeared to have embraced the motto that wisdom is where you find it. So, they're open, they're affirming, they accept what they see happening in the world around them. But on the other hand, they don't simply pick up and uncritically adopt the wisdom of the surrounding nations, holus bolus. They don't take it on board in its entirety. It's not uncritically accepted. Instead, it's evaluated, it's edited, and it's brought into line with Israel's own distinctive faith. So what do you think one of the key features of ancient Near Eastern wisdom literature would have been? What's its undergirding theology? It's been very polytheistic in terms of its orientation, acceptance of many, multiple gods. Do we find that present in the Old Testament wisdom literature? No, everything is viewed through a monotheistic, Yahwistic lens. In fact, what does the Old Testament suggest is the beginning, the source, the origin of wisdom? The fear of Yahweh, the fear of the Lord. So wisdom reflections were borrowed from the surrounding nations, or influenced by perhaps the surrounding nations, but at the same time they were filtered through belief in the one true God. So quick discussion, quick reflection point for you today. We see this tension, we see this present in Old Testament wisdom literature, this dynamic, acceptance but also questioning. Quick discussion point. How might this dynamic shape the way we live today? What does this suggest about what a flourishing, healthy, good life might in fact look like? Quick conversation with the person next to you. Okay, does anyone want to share any comments, thoughts, reflections? Put it out there, have a bit of a risk. Say something heretical. Yeah, okay. It's not a Sunday morning, okay? You can go. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, I guess it's around, what's our basic stance to culture, the world around us, in some senses it's asking here. And To some extent, the wisdom authors would say that, well, part of that is just an openness to hearing what's out there. It's not just simply a coming along and critically wiping it off simply because there may be some ideas that emerge out of there. Now, that might be the end point that we get to, and certainly that would have been the case for a lot of the wisdom literature. It's not being picked up, it's not being embraced. The theology that we're finding up there isn't being uncritically accepted by Israel's sages. But at the same time, the basic stance that they have to the culture, to the world around them, is one of openness. It's one of desire. Actually, maybe even take it a step more than openness. And this is the difference between, you write your complaints to me afterwards, okay? But not even an openness, but even a desire to learn, a desire to hear, a desire to see what those people out there are saying, not because we're just going to pick it up and take it on board, but because we actually believe that the way that the world has been set up through creation, that human beings can discern and make sense and kind of discern truths in the world around them, and that there might be a possibility that we can learn from them. Again, that we don't necessarily uncritically accept and adopt them, but a basic posture, a basic stance of openness and a desire to listen as well. Okay, so that's the first thing, this international character of wisdom literature. Let's look at the second character then, the experiential nature of wisdom literature. What did I say before? Wisdom literature writings is theology from below. Okay, so it's primarily based on human reflections about us, kind of looking at the world around us, creation around us, looking about how human beings relate to one another, looking about what's the consequences of doing good things, the consequences of doing bad things. Okay, reflecting on those things and then coming to kind of statements about the way the world works. Okay, it's primarily based on human reflections on life, experience, the created order, rather than divine revelation from above. One of my favourite Old Testament theologians is Walter Brueggemann, and Brueggemann's a bit of an iconoclast, says a little bit of controversial things every now and then, and he wrote a book, though, on the Old Testament wisdom literature, and I think he was a little bit flippant, but he entitled it, "In Man We Trust." Okay, so instead of the typical, in God we trust, in man we trust. Why was he kind of titling it like that? Because what's he saying? Where does kind of the wisdom, where does the reflection, where does the discernment come through? Human reflection, human reasoning, looking at the world around us and trying to put pieces together. Okay, in man we trust. So the experiential character of wisdom is seen, for example, when we have a look at the issue of adultery. Okay, so quick discussion point, quick exercise. Compare Exodus 20:14 with Proverbs chapter 5, with the question, why shouldn't you commit adultery? Okay. Okay, give you about 1 more minute. Why shouldn't you commit adultery? Okay, I'll take that petering out of conversation as a sign for us. Exodus 20. Why shouldn't you commit adultery? Because you're told not to, aren't you? God says, you shall not commit adultery, therefore do not do it. Can we see how that is a classic example of what we're talking about? Revelation or theology from above. God tells you, don't commit adultery, therefore don't do it. Okay. Now, Proverbs is going to get to that same destination, that same endpoint, but it's going to take a little bit of a different route to get there. What does Proverbs have to say? How would you classify Proverbs' argument? Why shouldn't you? Okay, so it's an illustrated text. Okay, yep. Okay, so it lays out the repercussions. It lays out in particular the possible consequences of what happens if you commit adultery. Anything else that people talked about? Yeah, that's right. So it also recognises, that our lives are lived under divine view as well. And so that's, verse 521, for your ways are in full view of the Lord, and he examines all your paths. But then it goes back also to the consequences in verse 22. The evil deeds, and by that, because it's summarising the chapter, it's kind of got adultery in mind there. The evil deeds of the wicked ensnare them. The cause of their sins hold them fast. For lack of discipline, they will die, led astray by their own great folly. So they both get to the same point. They both conclude that, this is really an unhealthy and not good thing to do. Do not do it, okay? But kind of the path that they're getting there is different. Revelation from above, revelation from below. And the Proverbs is all about reflecting on human experience, about what happens when someone commits adultery, the outcomes, the overflowing, and the bad consequences. Therefore, don't do it. Okay? So it's experiential. It's based on experience. Okay. Pardon? It's those wayward women, that's right. And can you see when we're reading through how very much, and you might not have seen it before, but it's very much being written as a text to young men in particular about trying to provide them advice. That's right, but it's they've got nothing to do with it. It's only it's those women out there. Yeah. So in the final analysis though, as important as experience is, the Bible is clear that the true source of wisdom remains God. The wisdom books suggest that the only way of attaining true wisdom is to have a close and respectful relationship with God, which it refers to as the close and respectful relationship, beginning source of wisdom, the fear of the Lord. Okay. And as I've said already, the wisdom books in the Old Testament are tremendously diverse. But one of the things that holds them together, one of the things that we see popping up in all kind of three of the books is this notion of the fear of the Lord as being central to wisdom. Got three texts there. Can I maybe just get someone to read out for the class Proverbs 1 verse 7, someone else to read out Job 28:28, and someone else to read out Ecclesiastes 12:13. So if you've got it there, shout it out. Who's got Proverbs 1 verse 7 for us? Okay, go for it. Yep.
The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction.
Fantastic. So the fear of the Lord is the beginning knowledge, beginning of wisdom. Okay. Other text, Job 28:28. Yep, go for it at the back.
He says of human race, fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. Shun evil with understanding.
Fantastic. So the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. And Ecclesiastes 12:13. Okay. Sorry. Yep, go for it. Okay, so again, Ecclesiastes does come to this conclusion around the whole importance of really fearing the Lord and keeping his commandments. So quick discussion with the people on the table around you. What do you think the fear of the Lord means? What's the sense that you get when you read that kind of declaration, that kind of text? How might it be the source, the origin, the beginning of wisdom? Go for it. A minute or so. Okay, so part of this the series is we're also asking, how does this help us live better today? The wisdom authors would want to suggest that, well, the fear of the Lord is central to living better in the world. It's central for your life, it's central for your success, it's central for your flourishing as a human being. What might you say you think the fear of the Lord is? How would you define it? What are maybe some of the synonyms that you might want to chuck around when we're talking about fear of the Lord? Again, let's step out, risk it. Say something, please. Yeah. Okay, yep. Yep. Okay, so we'll just go again. So I think we've heard respect come through as well, awe, reverence. Yep. Okay. Sovereignty, majesty. Okay. Yep. Okay. Others we didn't talk about anything else come to people. Did anyone go to terror at all? Did that come up, or we think that that's kind of part of the problematic perhaps nature of if we go with fear? Yep. Yep. Yeah. Yes, yep. Yep.
Lots of people come into a place to place with God or Jesus and the angels. It was that flat on the face, flat on the ground face.
Yep.
That wasn't, I might just lie down here for a while and suddenly have some being in God's presence.
Yeah.
A frightening place, they were usually told to stand up.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, and that's a really great point because, in the Western world, we do typically tend to, let's say, domesticate or kind of emphasise God's immanence, God's closeness, God's relationship with us. But part of this is also recognising the holiness, the transcendence, the otherness of God, and that an appropriate human response to when you encounter that which is holy or that which is other is on some level, a holy fear as well. Yeah, okay. One thing that we didn't get to, which I think is really important just in terms of conceptualising Hebrew thought, is that we all kept kind of talking around attitude words, okay? But you can't really separate these things in Hebrew thought in that attitude is bound up with action as well. And so to have a fear of the Lord is not just to have a certain attitude to the Lord, but it's also to live in a certain way in relationship to the Lord. So it's a living in a way of, if we're going to talk about fear, what do we think the primary human expectation, action, response will look like? Obedience, okay, is really hard of what it puts. So it's not just simply about kind of how we feel inside, it's actually how we're living our lives as well. And so that call to obedience, that call to response, that call to a properly human relationship with God, which recognises that God is sovereign and I am not, and actually to live out of that in our, as I said, response of obedience and trust and a commitment to God as well. So it's both an attitude, but it's also an action as well. It's how we live our lives. Okay, how are we going for time? 10 minutes? Okay. So, what was the first characteristic of wisdom literature that we talked about? International. And what did that suggest about what it means to live a flourishing life according to wisdom? Part of it involves a genuine openness and interesting around the culture around us, a willingness to learn and grow, but also not critically accepted. The second thing was that it is experiential. It focuses on observing experiences in the world around us, but it nevertheless also emphasises the importance of fear of the Lord as well as central to our flourishing as human beings. Okay, the third aspect then of wisdom is that wisdom is creational. Okay. Now, a significant difference between the wisdom literature and the rest of the Old Testament, in particular the Pentateuch, is its primary image of God. Okay. In the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, does anyone want to shout out, what do you think the primary image of God is? Holy, okay. Yeah. lawgiver, okay, but maybe something that comes slightly before the law as well. Rescuer, redeemer, saviour, the one who brings Israel out of Egypt, okay? If we had to describe God, we'd describe God in terms of Jesus. And if you want to know what God looks like according to Christians, what do we say? Jesus. And if we want to say in particular what reveals God, what act? The cross. That's right. The death and resurrection of Jesus is where we come to learn who God is. If I was to ask you as a Jewish person, or to go back into the Old Testament context and say, how do you know what God looks like? You wouldn't say you look like you know it in terms of the death and resurrection of Jesus. What would your answer be? Do you want to know? The Exodus. Okay, so that's the kind of God that we worship, the deliverer, the redeemer, the one who brought us up out of Egypt. So this is the dominant image of God in much of the Old Testament, the redeemer, the saviour, the deliverer from Egypt. But in the wisdom literature, this activity of God does not receive anywhere near the same attention. In fact, one of the primary characteristics, or one of the defining characteristics of wisdom literature, is that it rarely refers to the great events of Old Testament history. You don't find references to Abraham in the wisdom literature. Okay, you don't find references to Sinai in the wisdom literature. You don't find references to covenant, all those kind of great events which are central to the Torah, central to the prophets as well. It just don't pop up in the wisdom literature. Instead, the primary image of God is as creator. Okay, not saviour, deliverer, redeemer, but as creator. Now, in order to demonstrate the creational theology of the wisdom literature, let's look at a common concern of the whole of the Old Testament, whether it's the law, the prophets, the wisdom literature, and that is the concern with justice and compassion for the poor and the needy. An interesting difference between the law and the prophets on one hand and wisdom on the other is the motivational appeal or the basis for this teaching. So in other words, why? Why should we show compassion and mercy and grace to the needy? Okay. So a quick exercise. Compare the following passages. We've got some from the Torah and then also with some from the wisdom literature, and then say, what is the theological and the motivational basis for the teaching of these texts regarding the poor and needy? So in other words, why? Okay, go for it. If you're working with groups, you might want to divide it up and get someone to maybe look at the first lot of passages and someone to look at the second lot of passages. That's one way you could do it. Or anyway, you go for it. Okay. What stood out when we're looking through those first passages, the ones from the Torah, in particular Exodus and Deuteronomy? What's the motivational basis? What's the motivational appeal? Why do we need to care for the needy and the poor? Okay, so you've kind of experienced it yourself on some level. You know what it's like to be needy and poor. Okay, so that's one of the elements. Yep.
The poor person is, in a sense, a representation of where Israel once was.
Oh.
The person who helps them is acting as a representation of what God did.
what God did. Yep. Okay. So it's connected with the fact that you know how the Lord brought you out of your situation of need and oppression, out of your bondage and slavery in Egypt. And therefore, what's the expected response for beings who are created in the image of that God? You'll do the same. You'll extend the same grace that has been shown to you. Part of your worshipful response, part of your life of obedience, part of your fear of the Lord is what? That you will help the poor and the needy. Okay? It's one way in which it's manifested. Okay. Slightly different, though, from Proverbs. Is there any talk of you being a slave in Egypt in Proverbs? No, that's not. Again, it's getting to the same point. It's a bit like adultery. We're getting at the same end kind of culmination, but we're getting there via a different path. So what does Proverbs and Job instead tend to emphasise? Okay, so it's honouring to God. Okay. Be rewarded. Okay, yep. Okay, so we're all created by God. Rich and poor alike are created by God. Yep, fantastic. Okay, great points. Yep, anything else that people talked about?
You're accountable to God either way. Like if you do the wrong thing, you're accountable to Him for your punishment. If you do the right thing, you're accountable.
Okay, yep, so there's an accountability to God. Yep, okay, fantastic. Anything else that people wanted to talk about? He's called our Maker. Okay, so it's part of, again, responding to our Maker, our Creator. And there is the suggestion, I can't remember which passage it was, that what we do to a fellow human being, we are in fact doing to his or her Maker. Okay, so is this connection between, in Exodus, it's about how we live in response to what God has done to us. In the creation, in this wisdom literature, well, it's what you do is actually how you're acting towards your Creator. What we do to a fellow human being, we are in fact doing to his or her Maker. So let me conclude with a passage from the New Testament. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?" The king and Israel's sages would reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." Jesus there is going back to the Old Testament wisdom literature and picking up that recognition of what we're doing for our disenfranchised, poor and needy neighbours, we're in fact also doing for God as well.
Okay, so time to find your seat and we'll get going again.
Okay, so I'm going to go through the final thing that I wanted to say about wisdom literature, and then we'll have probably 10-15 minutes at the end for any questions or reflections from people. So we talked about the writings, the wisdom literature having three common traits or characteristics: international, experiential and creational. The final thing that I want to say about wisdom literature is that it's an intellectual activity that makes certain contested claims about reality. The best way really to think about Israel's sages, their wisdom people, is that they were kind of like, the closest equivalent is like a modern day scientist. So what does a scientist do, a hard scientist? There's kind of 3 steps in the basic scientific process. Okay, so maybe that's the third kind of, I guess it depends on which process you're going for. Yeah, that's right. You can start with a hypothesis though, yep. Yeah, okay. So they observe the world around them, they reflect on what they're seeing, and then they come up with a hypothesis, or they make a statement about the way that they function. Observe, reflect, hypothesize, okay? This is very similar to the wisdom literature, and we see this particularly in, for instance, the book of Proverbs. That Israel's sages look at the world around them, they reflect on what's happening, and then they make statements about the way that it works. And in particular, what they argue, is that there is a correlation between deed and consequence, okay? And in particular, good deed, good consequence. Bad deed, bad consequences arrive. Okay, so if you work hard, according to Proverbs, you will be rewarded, you'll get ahead. If you're lazy and you don't put in the work, you'll fall behind. Okay, we might say, using a modern proverb, you reap what you sow. And so what the authors of Proverbs did is they looked around and they saw that this is how things work on the physical realm, okay? That the farmer who goes out and ploughs his seed and does the hard work generally gets a good crop. The lazy farmer kind of suffers the consequences. So they looked at the world around them. They saw that that's kind of how it happened on the physical realm. And then the Old Testament authors extrapolated from the physical realm to the spiritual realm, okay? And so if you do bad deeds, you have bad consequences became, if you sin, you suffer, okay? Or if you are pious, things will work out for you well in life, okay? Now, Proverbs recognises that there are some exceptions to these general rules, but it's very much a minority voice. There may be 6 or so Proverbs that break down this paradigm out of a book of, let's say, 300 or so Proverbs, okay? Much more of Proverbs works with what I've got there, a retributive theological paradigm, okay? There's a retributive, that things come about. Good deeds lead to good outcomes, bad deeds lead to bad outcomes, okay? And we do need to recognise that this contains a certain element of truth, that this is the way that on some level the world does work. The world does operate according to some extent, a retributive theological paradigm. Generally speaking, if you do bad consequences, not always, if you do bad consequences, if you do bad deeds, if you do bad actions, generally speaking, bad consequences, okay? If you drink and drive, there is an increased likelihood that you will have an accident, okay? Or if you don't study for an exam, like my children have got this week, what will be the consequence of that? You probably, let's hope they don't fail, okay? They probably just don't do as well as they could do, okay? But there will be a consequence between their actions and their outcomes. But problems arise when we seek to rigidly and dogmatically apply this paradigm to every situation, when we fail to recognise that life doesn't actually fit into these neat boxes, that life does not always work out according to neat retributive principles. Sometimes irresponsible people actually become healthy and wealthy, okay? Or sometimes drink drivers get home safe. Or even worse, what happens? They kill somebody else through their activities. Okay? They end up hurting other innocent bystanders. And so this is where Ecclesiastes and Job come into the picture. They seek to deconstruct the dominant paradigm that we find in the book of Proverbs. And I don't have time to talk about Job, so let me just finish with 3 things about the message of Ecclesiastes, and we'll wind up with this. The first thing from Ecclesiastes. is that life cannot be adequately explained by retributive thought. Okay? The author recognises that life doesn't always work out the way that we think it should, that good actions do not always lead to good outcomes, and vice versa. The author of Ecclesiastes emphasises that this general way of viewing things, this general paradigm, really oversimplifies the complexities of life, and it misleads and leads to frustration for those who actually believe it. Let's have a look at just one text, Ecclesiastes. Let's go just as an example. Ecclesiastes 7:15. Okay. In the meaningless of life, in this meaningless life of mine, I have seen both of these things. The righteous perishing in their righteousness, and the wicked living long in their wickedness. These things sometimes happen. It doesn't work out the way that we always think it should. Okay? Sometimes the righteous will perish in their righteousness, and the wicked will live long in their wickedness. So life cannot easily be explained by this retributive thought. The second thing is that life's meaning cannot be discerned through the traditional pursuits of wisdom, of wealth, of power, of pleasure, and legacy. Now, in some ways, the author of Ecclesiastes was actually writing into a society which is not too dissimilar from our own. People were preoccupied with the need to succeed, with the need to achieve, to produce and consume. Ecclesiastes warns that while these endeavours may not necessarily be wrong in and of themselves, they are ultimately unsatisfactory. They're ultimately futile. They will not bring the great fulfilment, they will not bring the great reward that they promise. This is particularly true when it gets to wealth. Wealth will not bring you, according to Ecclesiastes, the dissatisfaction that you desire. Why? What do we think he says? Because no matter how much you get, you will still want more. Let's read Ecclesiastes 5, verse 10. Those who love money never have enough. Those who love wealth are never satisfied with their income. This too is meaningless. Okay? But there is this constant desire, and we see it all around the world in terms of power as well. Power ultimately leaves unsatisfactory. Why? Because you just want more. You just want more. You just want more. Okay. And the final point, though, from Ecclesiastes is that life is there to be enjoyed. Life is a gift to be enjoyed. In spite of all these things, that life is meaning is not to be found in wisdom, wealth, pleasure, power, whatever those things, the author of Ecclesiastes calls on the audience to relish and to savour life. Okay, to enjoy the life that you have been given. This enjoyment is not to be found in human efforts, it's not to be found in human achievement, but in the everyday gifts that God graciously provides his people. And in particular, he encourages you to enjoy your work, to enjoy your partner, to enjoy your food, and to enjoy your drink as well. Let's read one text. Actually, we'll finish up with these two texts. Ecclesiastes 2:24. People can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their toil. This too, I see, is from the hand of God. So enjoy your work, enjoy your food, enjoy your drink. Or Ecclesiastes 9:7-10. Go, eat your food with gladness and drink your wine with a joyful heart. for God has already approved what you do. Always be clothed in white and always anoint your head with oil. Enjoy life with your wife, whom you love, all the days of this meaningful life that God has given you under the sun, all your meaningless days. For this is your lot in life and in your toilsome labour under the sun. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. For in the realm of the dead, where you are going, there is neither working, nor planning, nor knowledge, nor wisdom. And so what I'd like to say is conclude is that the wisdom literature and the Old Testament as a whole is profoundly focused on enjoying life in the present. Christians, we tend to focus on, or our emphasis is, we've just got to get through this life, because where will our enjoyment be found? Where will our fulfillment be found? With heaven, with God for eternity. The Old Testament is profoundly this life-centric. Now, that may be because it doesn't have a developed conception of the afterlife, but I think it also provides a really important, maybe correction, a really important balance for us today. That the things that you've been given by God are gifts for you to enjoy. Your work is there for you to enjoy. Your partner is there for you to enjoy. Your food is there for you to enjoy. Your drink. Actually, I just realised I'm in a Baptist church. Why am I talking about your drink? Okay, your non-alcoholic drink is there for you to enjoy, because those are gifts from God. And so enjoy it. Okay. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you for that. Yep. Okay. Cool.
To that one.
This is where you need to have that. There's some software that you can put up where people can ask questions, and it doesn't put their name
knowing where
next
it comes
to
from.
them. That's right. Yeah.
Well, you can whisper it in my ear or something like that. That's the best we can do tonight. Anyone have a question to start us off? I've got one while you're thinking. And this is pure curiosity, really.
Yep.
When you talked about the A&E text having quite a bit of similarity,
Yep.
where do they part ways with the Old Testament? What kinds of things do they hold up that we would not want to follow?
Yeah. Well, I mean, fundamentally, a lot of it is not dissimilar in terms of their basic teaching and orientation. So a lot of the Proverbs, again, if I was to put a lot of the Proverbs up there, you wouldn't be able to tell it from picking it whether that's a proverb from the Bible or a proverb from another ancient Near Eastern text. Because they're dealing with a lot of kind of the everyday realities of life and what it means to be successful and how to get ahead in life in that context, there's not a lot of difference really often between that. The areas where they do diverge is when they start to reflect on their theology or the God, God who's responsible for this, and and so that's the main emphasis. But in terms of the practicalities of what they're teaching, they're very similar to what we're finding in the Old Testament. Yeah.
Peter? Oh, let me come to you.
Thanks. I really like what you're saying about the whole openness, and perhaps that we need to have a bit more of that. I guess my question is, in a society that doesn't do debate well, have you seen an example of this done well?
Yeah, well, that's a fantastic question, and our society pushes against any kind of nuanced discussion or nuanced conversation. I mean, you look at something like Twitter. What is it, 280 characters, or how many characters have you got in there? I don't know. It used to be half of what it is now. Anyway, it's the whole focus on being able to get a quick response and to score points is how we have conversations these days. And generally speaking, we're not genuinely concerned with listening to the other. We only listen to the other as a springboard to kind of make our own points. So in some senses, what we're arguing for here in terms of a genuine openness is in fact being something that is genuinely countercultural as well, because it's not something that we're kind of trained to do or that we see naturally happening in the world around us. So that means that it's difficult for us to do because we're not actually, a lot of our practice as Christians is actually shaped by, we'd like to say that our practice as Christians is shaped by the scriptures, okay? But the reality is that a lot of our practice as Christians is shaped predominantly by the culture and the world that we see around us. That sometimes we baptise in, Christian theology, or sometimes maybe we supplement. Now, I would hope and pray that that's not the case, but that's often the reality, especially for people who probably come from the more nominal aspect of the faith, that it's kind of Christianity is something that happens on a Sunday and that's kind of tucked on top of everything. So given that that's kind of the cultural water in which we swim, genuine listening and engagement is difficult. And the problem is also so first of all, it's difficult to do culturally. The other aspect that it's difficult to do is that it's difficult to do. So many of the examples that kind of come to mind that I think of is that when it comes to that genuine engagement, it actually often comes about or is kind of bound up with people not actually holding true to what they believe themselves. And so in their desire to listen and to be open to the other, it almost kind of involves that kind of, okay, I'm going to give up in terms of, what I believe. Maybe I'm speaking a little bit out of turn here. No, I can't. I'll have a chat with you afterwards about the example. I've got one I can share, but it's just, I just don't want to share it in public, especially when it could go. It could be used again. It's to do with my wife's work, and my wife works at Baptist Care, so I don't want to kind of go through that kind of in a public kind of forum. But have a conversation afterwards. Yeah.
Any other questions? Lois.
Yeah.
You're saying wisdom literature is international.
Yeah.
The creation stories. There were creation stories earlier than Genesis was written. So some people might say, well, haven't the writers of Genesis just copied from an earlier creation story? Is there any substance to that?
Okay. My quick response there, my sidestep and dodge of that answer is that that's so that's in the Genesis. So we're not looking at Genesis this evening, but my more serious answer to you on that would be, so like we see in the wisdom literature, there is other ancient Near Eastern creation stories that are circulating around. So there's stories from Egypt, there is stories from Mesopotamia. I never think the value, I believe that the Genesis creation story is the inspired word of God, and it is therefore the accurate and authoritative account for how we understand creation, the world around us, how things came into being. But what I'd say is that those other ancient Near Eastern creation stories they can help us understand the Genesis creation story because they're being written by people who are living in a similar cultural context, in a similar cultural time, and they therefore provide, in some sense, a context for understanding what's happening in the Genesis creation story. Or they at least give us a frame, because they're coming from a similar time, in a similar place, in a similar worldview. When you start to study those stories, there is things that you might see in the Genesis creation account that we wouldn't see because we're reading it through the lens of a modern Western kind of scientific reader. Part of reading a text well is trying to get back into that original world and hear it how the original author and audience would have heard it. And studying those ancient Near Eastern texts helps with that kind of that process. So, they are valuable in the sense of giving us a context for understanding, I think, the Genesis creation story. Yeah. Okay. Any other comments or questions? If not, we might have an early mark. How are we going? We've got 4 minutes. There we go. Yep.
Jace.
You've just given us a really quick kind of overview of wisdom and, by my count, 3 books.
Yep.
What's the usefulness of that? Because often we'll maybe dig deep into one. What's the usefulness of having this big picture?
Yeah, okay. The primary usefulness of doing it when you're dealing with the wisdom literature is because the wisdom literature actually holds attention when you're dealing with it. So the problem is, if you're just to get something like the book of Proverbs, you're potentially going to end up with a very imbalanced view of life. Because Proverbs is all about that kind of retributive paradigm, basically, that if you start to go with your good deeds, you can expect good consequences. And if you live your life through the lens of Proverbs, that's what you're going to see, okay? Now, the problem is, if we just simply do that, we suddenly kind of bump up with the reality of life, which actually then we see that that's not actually always how it kind of works out in practice. So that's why we also need our books like Job and Ecclesiastes, because they help to provide that counter voice. They help to provide that argument. They actually show us that, yes, there is a lot of truth on some level to what Proverbs is saying, but it does break down at times. And unless we've got that other voice and unless we're paying attention to it, yeah, it helps to give us that kind of that balanced perspective on the way that life really works. Yeah. So that's why I think we've got to study them as a whole.